not make this a long introduction.
This meeting is being recorded.
To introduce Professor Michael Nylan, who is Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley, and her interests lie in the intellectual history of early China as well as its modern reception. She is author of very many books and very many articles, including, very interestingly, I thought myself, a children's book that I don't know much about, but is very intriguing to see, called Blossom on the Run with Robert Litz, and a book about called Lives of Confucius with Thomas A. Wilson. And there are so many articles and other publications to mention that I couldn't possibly list them all in the time that we have, but it is a very impressive career, and she has obviously influenced very much her field as well as those that she has, I'm sure, supervised and taught along the way, who are themselves also working in the field today. So we are honoured to have her here. Professor Richard King, who will be speaking in response afterwards, is professor at the Institute of Philosophy in the University of Bern, with a special focus on the history of philosophy. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge on Aristotle, on life and death, and specializes in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy as well as Asian philosophy, and has recent publications, including works on Aristotle, Plato, and indeed also on Mengzi. Professor Trenton Wilson has recently, congratulations, just joined the Department of, he's just joined as an assistant professor of East Asian Studies and History at Princeton University. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, where I suspect that he may have had some encounter with Professor Michael Nylan, who may have even been his supervisor. Is that not the case?
Yes, that is in fact the case.
Yes, okay, yeah, I had to guess there, the maths of that. Trenton is an intellectual, cultural, and political historian of early China. He's special interests in the history of Chinese classicism and commentarial traditions, including the Xuanxue thinkers. And he is currently working on a book project on the history of political debates in China surrounding the very interesting topic of trust and suspicion from the pre-Qin period, just before the Qin period, I believe, to the 3rd century in China, which sounds like a fascinating project that he's currently working on. So those are our 3 contributors today, and I will welcome Professor Michael Nylan to begin talking to us once she's had the opportunity to share her slides, which she has also, and we'll be able to upload those to the website, I believe, following the lecture for anybody who would like to have a copy of those, and it may also, I'm sure, inform the later discussion on the 14th. So thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Thank you to my host, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And I think the way I think of this morning's lecture, oh great, I hope I'm not losing my voice, is Xue 101. For those of you who don't know 101 because you're not Americans, what this means in America is you're taking a brief course on something that is totally basic. It's not elevated, but it often includes subjects that those at more advanced levels forget to engage in. So when I was asked whether I would participate in this, I'm currently working on a Cambridge History China book, a new book dedicated to Confucianism, and my own belief is that's an incoherent concept. But I said, I'll do it as long as I can talk about classical learning. And so that's what I'm doing. And these are some thoughts that have arisen in the course of preparing that. And so I'll now try to share my screen. And where is it? Okay, I'm having trouble sharing my screen. So let me open this and see if I can now share. Get back to sharing. Get back to sharing. We troubleshooted this, so it shouldn't be, there it is. Okay. So Xue 101. If you only had one thing to take away from my talk this morning, it would be that the emphasis on Xue in the period that I work in, the early empires, And I define those as 323 BC to AD 316, that Xue is much more about emulation and learning from emulation than it is about book learning. So that's the main theme. You can now all leave if you feel like it, because in a way I'm just going to demonstrate how much more important emulation is and how much more complex a task it is for would-be learners. When I was asked to give this talk, I immediately thought of colleagues of mine in China, including Roger Ames and a former mentor of mine, Henry Rosemont. And I thought, what would they do if they were giving this talk? Well, I know exactly what they would do. They would begin with the Da Xue and the Zhongyong. And in theory, these are marvelous texts, but actually I can't make sense of them myself, okay? To me, they're far too abstract. And so I've never found much guidance in them. It helps me a lot that in my period, these were not particularly believed to be extraordinary texts. They were part of the Liji, and the Liji itself was known to be a very late addition to the classical works, and actually surprisingly seldom cited until we get to Zhengxuan, who changed all of that. So what I'm going to do is talk about Zhengming in relation to manuscript culture and nomenclature for classical learning. I'm going to talk about how you devise models for learning and emulation, how you find them, how you then try to apply them, and finally, what are the Han Dynasty notions of who is wise, worthy, or sagely? So I know that Zhengming actually doesn't really mean language. It really is about rectifying oneself or aligning oneself to one's social role. But for the moment, I'm going to take the misuse of Zhengming because I was trained by all of my teachers to pay crucial attention to the words that are used in every single text. I know other people are trained in different ways so that they get the gist of a passage, but for me, every single character matters, and that's how I was taught, and that's how I believe we should read these highly sophisticated texts that we have at our disposal from the early empires. I basically stole this quote from Kai Vogelsang, writing on scribal culture. Scribal culture is something I don't actually believe in. The people who are writing the texts are doing this in a very particular way, and they're all members of the governing elite, meaning these are people operating at the highest level. They're hardly humble scribes, but Kai Vogelsang's prose on scribe throughout is well worth reading, very well worth reading. The first thing I want to say is we're in the world of manuscript culture. We are not in the world of database searches. We're not in C-text. We're not in paperback copies. I want to really drive this point home because I think especially philosophers ignore this. In the world of manuscript culture, you are receiving a text from someone whom you value, whom you would regard as having something to teach you. You are then hand copying it yourself, and then you are amending it the way I would amend the notes to a teacher lecturing in a hall. So manuscripts are more like bijiban than they are like anything else. And that's why we see tremendous variation, even when they appear to probably be citing the same text. But we need to get back into a world that is not book bound or computer bound if we are to understand how they're interacting with their texts. Okay, we're also in a world of small textual communities. We are absolutely not in the world of one China. That would be today's world, so we really need to think away modernity. And here's a typical statement, but I could have found 15 or 20 other ones. And this is Bangu talking from the capital. In the past, all of these local lords had different customs, and two places less than 100 li apart could not communicate with one another when their representatives happened to meet for any occasion. Now, actually, this is more true of Bangu's world than he's willing to talk about publicly, because the fiction of the court is everything is unified. But for those of us who are historians, and I am a proud historian and an occasional diagnostic philosopher, we routinely look at maps that show that almost half of the empire is basically incompletely under the control of the Han. And we know that because half of the empire is not paying taxes. If anybody wants to see those maps, they're always on my computer and they can shoot me an email. And they're really quite astonishing. What people of the time knew that we have forgotten is that no manuscript would be passed down, sorry for the BB, unless it provided real world solutions to problems confronted by members of the governing elite. All right, so these texts were produced by members of the governing elite for people like themselves. Low literacy rates precluded writing for anything like a general reader. And so I really want to emphasize this because much of the rhetoric is deeply coded. What you see, unless you know the tropes, is not what you're meant to get. And that's extremely important. This is not esoteric transmission. Everybody knows the code who is a member of the governing elite. But we really have to emphasize that no person I have ever met can read these texts absent the use of commentaries and absent broad reading across many of them so that you begin to see what the tropes are. The second thing I'm going to say is, what are members of the governing elite preoccupied with? Well, they're preoccupied with governing. And although they take Wu Wei and Jurzu, know what is enough as the default modes, in times of crisis, whether they're perceived or real, that demand action, there was no Kantian division between, oh, this is moral over here, and this is pragmatic over here. And so Bernard Williams, as many of you may know, one of the truly great 20th century philosophers, argued that the ancient Greeks were in better shape in some respects than modern academics. And that's because they didn't divide moral from pragmatic solutions. The solutions had to satisfy, ideally, both demands, both criteria. In addition, there was an extra demand. All solutions had somehow to address what was called the people's feelings. Now, in the period I work in, Ren does not typically, although it sometimes means the Lao Bai Xing, it doesn't typically mean that. It means people in the governing elite. So we also have to be thinking about that. Major stakeholders, people who, and interest groups, all of these people have to be consulted when a situation is devised. What follows from that is that there is no essential difference between personal cultivation, note I do not say self-cultivation, social cultivation, or preparation for government service. Our emphasis on authenticity is just such a product of Euro-American romantic, inflected, liberal, democratic vision. It is so inappropriate to be applying to these people who are generating texts of the time. One of the things I put in very small letters was a reference to Sijie Wei's Democracy in China. And I would also direct everyone to Raymond Goyce's book, History and Illusion in Politics. Stuart Hampshire would also be another important philosopher. All of these people are saying in one way or another, let's get out of the liberal democratic mold. And Goyce and Stuart Hampshire in particular are saying most people who deal in political philosophy haven't a clue how politics actually works. I believe that to be true. We can get to that in the Q&A. Xue is not predominantly book learning during the early empires, post-Han, or even to or after Song. We can go into why I'm saying even after Song in the Q&A. Clearly there are massive printings in Song, but those massive printings are designed, they're done by the government, and the only people who can purchase them are rather high ranking officials. So Joe McDermott and others who work in the history of book culture in China tell us that it's really not until Ming that some printed editions are valued in the same way that hand copied editions are valued. Oral transmission and teaching predominates in manuscript culture. And ritual encounters are the settings for transmitting teachings formally and informally. In other words, authority still resides primarily in authoritative figures, not in the text ascribed to them. And we all know the famous Zhuangzi passage about how texts are the dregs of the teachings, but I could find plenty of other texts, including some identified typically as Confucian, that are saying what we have is a mere remnant of the teachings that we used to have. And the only way we can hope for real transmission is through master to master transmission. By the way, this is not esoteric transmission. There are people like Igor Grevnev who like to talk about esoteric transmission. Really, no, this is not esoteric. It is master to master, and so not necessarily public transmission. But the reason we have these texts is because they're handed down and circulated. And if the masters are famous, they're circulated fairly widely and sometimes even outside the textual community. So the real question I had when I was thinking about classical learning in the early empires, so Zhangguo, Qin-Han, Wei-Jin, is, well, text experts obviously had authority, but how much authority and of what sort of authority did they have, all right? And what I would like to say is that text experts, and of course the highest of them are called Boshi and are academicians at the Capitol. These positions also exist at the commandery and county level, though at much lower rank, obviously. But the Capitol Boshi are regarded primarily as advisors on precedents to the imperial court. And what happens to them if their advice is good is they're promptly promoted to being commandery governors, all right? So they immediately go out into the world and try to apply what they have learned by way of textual learning. This career path is so plain, even from the standard histories, that we have to take it serious. The other thing that I think most people who don't work in the period don't know is that text experts are not experts in an authoritative classics. So you think, oh, this is an expert in the odes or in the documents or in the changes, but no, each text expert is an expert in one reading, and there are many, of an authoritative classic. All right, that's an extremely important point. And one reason it's extremely important for us to figure that out is because most of those commentaries are now gone, right? And that's a function of really Neo-Confucian attacks on Han learning. But it's also a function of what happens in manuscripts. As someone says, well, now we can, this manuscript supersedes that manuscript. It's also a function of the enormous losses that come to manuscripts. There's a French scholar who has said 80% of the capital holdings are lost at the end of every dynasty because the capital is razed in part or in total. And it's wooden buildings, everything goes up in flames, right? So they're natural processes, they're conscious processes, but really we need to work a lot harder if we want to understand what's going on the text with text experts at the time. The final point I want to make is that many texts in Han say that people who are experts in these traditions are only one of a much broader range of people who serve the court and have authority. Bangu mentions 14 types, the Liji mentions 10, we can go on and on and on. But this is not hard to find, that text experts, this is not an empire of texts, in other words. This is an empire of servants, as they style themselves, to the court. And some of them are famous for their knowledge of commentarial traditions. Many others of them are not famous for that at all. Okay, what authority did Xue confer in what setting? Here are the kinds of authority that people command in the Han Dynasty. And part of number 6 in terms would be relevant here. It's in terms of some special expertise, and expertise in a commentary would be there. But none of the people that I know of, including classical masters, only trained in classical learning. For example, Huan Tan was training simultaneously in classical learning from Yang Shong and with a swords master. That's the typical profile. And if you go into their biographies, that you see is the typical profile. Others combine classical learning with legal training or administrative experience. But anyway, only one tiny part of 6 has to do with those who are experts in classical learning. When we turn to 11 and 12, classical learning is one way of many that people could make could contribute to their family reputations made locally. And classical learning is one way but not the only way, to gain a kind of messianic authority at the local level. As you can see, there are plenty of other ways to get status and office holding and aggregate wealth and impressive looks and bearing. This doesn't only come from being a ritualist. And so here we are. This is not, as we often construe it, an empire of texts. The other thing that I really want to say is that Sheldon Pollock taught us something that we all need to know, that the meaning of any classic in any early civilization is a function of competing meanings as they have come down to us. What we try to do as historians or as diagnostic philosophers is recover the meaning its author or compiler wanted to convey to the very small textual community to whom it was addressed. But any classic acquires meanings over time, and the meanings that it holds for people today may be quite different, and they're equally valid so long as we realize the difference between these three levels of meaning. The same could be said for any text we might be reading in the early period. We have to think away modernity if we're going to do a good job of trying to recover the meaning that were earlier. So I'm going to just leave this for people to peruse at their leisure. But a rule is not a Confucian, and a Confucian is not to be conflated with Chinese. And one of the most interesting things that I've discovered really in the last year, I should have known it, but I just discovered it, is that many people whom we would call Ru, for example, Ban Gu, the historian, absolutely would not have called themselves that. And that's very important for us to know. So we have to spend time figuring out, well, of course, this person commands classical learning, but would they have identified themselves ever as Ru? Ban Gu actually looks down on the Ru in some of his writings, though he does provide us with a marvelous Ru Lin Zhuan. Okay, I'm going to turn to the kinds of sources that we see and sources and objects of learning and emulation. And the first thing I'm going to do is tell you that this is a marvelous book. I really hope everyone reads it. It tells us what it calls anecdotes, and it says they're between history and philosophy. My only quibble with the book is this is history, plain and simple, once we leave behind modern academic fields. So I'll be spending a lot of time talking about histories as sources in the rest of this section, but I want very much on the table to be divinations, dreams, formal and informal discussions. These are all part of history and acknowledged as such in the early histories. So here's one on dreams right away, just to give you an idea. Duke Mu of Qin traveled up to heaven and had a dream or had an encounter. We certainly don't know what happened there, but he had a formal audience with the Lord on high. And why did he stay there so long? Apparently he was in what we would call a coma for several days. It's because there was something or someone there to learn from. And so this is part of history, and he comes back down to earth, and he is gifted with a sense of prophetic insight into the future of his own kingdom from that encounter. history is a mirror, and these are phrases that come from the early period. And I have done a lot of work on mirrors as it happened, and I don't want you to think of today's mirrors when you think of this. I want you to think of Han Dynasty mirrors, which were made out of metal, polished, and either were convex or concave, so things were distorted in a mirror, but still there were likenesses in the mirrors. And so when we're talking about history as mirror, history is made person to person, group to group. It's not abstract theory, where everyone in the early period knows that there will never be a historical event that is repeated in history. So history is far more like today's novels or movies. You're reading along, you're engaging with them in an imaginary way, asking, what would I have done were I in this situation? And those are rehearsals for real life in the governing elite. Because when you're confronted with those difficult situations, you must respond, and often must respond on the spur of the moment. What I'd really also like to say is that a lot of people in modern China, including some distinguished scholars, such as Yu Yingshi, have talked about there's an internal logic to history, or there's a necessary progression. That would be by others using those phrases. That is absolutely not the case if you're a historian, and it's easily shown that no one would have been talking in those terms. So what were they talking of? Well, they were talking of examining old heroes. And when you see the phrase jigu, it looks like you're examining antiquity, but go into any commentary from the period and they're defining it as examining old heroes. What did people do in the past that was successful to do when they were governing? That is the crux of the matter. And so here's a passage I put on from the Yizhou Shu. You know, whom, what or whom, what kind of exemplary figure did he revere? What kind of conduct or whom did he abhor? That is the question at hand. How do we deal with exemplary figures? Here's a passage from Zuozhuan. Basically, what we get from previous exemplars is a charge, a way to be in the world. And then we have to find, if we're the able ones, a way to good fortune, which could also be said to be blessings. And those blessings aren't just for the individual person. Often they're for the entire family or community, because we're talking about people who are lords of the land here. So if your kingdom is conquered, not only is your family extinguished or brought into slavery, but your people are now often enslaved as well. So people who are not taking these exemplary charges well, not thinking about this carefully enough, will find that they bring ruin to everything they're supposed to be caring about. I could go on and on. This one is about what is bearing, and how an impressive bearing increases one's patrimony and the good name down through the generations, and moreover forges alliances. Now, one of the things I wish to underscore here is that Carl Schmitt, a 20th century philosopher who would call himself a political realist, defines sovereignty as those allies you can count on in a crisis. Nothing else matters. So this is a perfect example of where morality and realpolitik come together in passages from the period. They are the same problem, and they have similar solutions and same solutions. Now, the people who are reading these texts are not dumb. They're smarter than we are, and I think that should be our working hypothesis. Okay, and here we have from the Huainanzi great awareness that people of the time are ascribing to the ancients, and the further back, the better, new ideas. And I wanted to say this is not just theoretical. During the Han Dynasty, there is a famous scholar of the documents named Zhang Ba, who is making 100 pian documents, basically out of other texts. And the court is seriously thinking of sponsoring it till he is implicated in a treason case, not substantially, but enough for them not to make this, not to appoint an academician for what they know to be not a documents, but they believe it's in the spirit of the documents. And so they are seriously considering making an academician's post for it. My working hypothesis is that members of the governing elite were far more sophisticated than we are. And here I'll simply cite a single example from the documents, which I've been working on for the last 5 or 6 years with my co-translator, He Yue of Shanxi Shifan Daxue. At least 3 and possibly 5 exemplary figures confront one and the same situation, and that is the bad last emperor king of the Shang. And all of them respond differently to exactly the same situation, yet all are said to be upholding their duty equally. The figures are Bigan, as we all know what happened to Bigan. He's carved up. We all know what happens to Jizi. He initially claims to be crazy, and then he flees the court and makes his way somehow to the Korean peninsula by legend. And then we have Weizi, who flees as well to different climes. Moving on. As we know, those of us who work in the early period, the same anecdote appears in multiple sources, but the sources do not invariably use it to convey the same idea. And Christian Schwermann has shown this beautifully in that book on anecdotes for the Han Shi Huaizhuan and the Shuo Yuan. 80% of the Shuo Yuan has counterpart passages in the Han Shi Huaizhuan, as all Han historians know. But the framing of those passages is often, not always, completely different. So we should never think that just because we read the passage, we know what the takeaway message is. We also have the case, and here I mention Jens Østergaard, I think, Peterson, path-breaking work on what's in a name. And he simply showed that the same thing is said by the mythical Sun Wu and by the well-attested general Sima Shangju. We can multiply these examples of where the same person says exactly the same thing. The more we become aware of this in classical learning, the more examples we can compile on this model. Okay, I had to mention Henry Rosemont because he was a teacher of mine, and Henry taught me that in contemporary English, there are concept clusters where words go together. And sometimes how these words go together is very obscure. They're not natural partners in our brains. we have to be taught the connections. And what I would like to say is that the same thing pertains to concept clusters in classical learning. The way I was taught to read classical Chinese by my teachers was I would be given a phrase and then I would guess what the next phrasing or passage would say. And that was my training in learning what words go together. And it was a good training. The other thing that I came late to was an awareness of what high cultural literacy meant for people in the Han. And they actually define it for us. This is not us reading something into it. It meant reading manuscripts and then weaving together passages from them, including elegant phrases, slogans, and classical allusions via complex prosodic and semantic rules. That was high cultural learning. That's how you proved you knew your stuff. So they're not searching for a particular way of being an author. They're searching for a particular way of showing others in the know that they command high cultural learning. So we also have something, a clustering of figures, okay? Once you start paying attention to this clustering of figures, you can learn some other things. I just give some of the most obvious ones here. And on the screen, you also see a passage from the Fayan where Ke is the exemplar, that is supposedly Yang Shong speaking. And which Ke? Well, he means Meng Ke, okay, mentions to us. And what do they share? Well, they're both men of courage. So of course he's thinking of Haoran Zhiqi here, but he goes on to say what he was courageous about, and by implication, Jingke is a pretty pathetic form of courage, something any Shaoran can do. Okay. What we often see is different exemplars paired together. And it's not that they're good or bad, it's that we need to ask ourselves, are they less good or more good? All right. So Zhou Gong is asking his son Bo Qin to go back. Zhou Gong is busy in the capital. So Bo Qin is supposed to go back to Lu. And then come back and report on his administration. Well, it takes him many years to come back. And Zhou Gong says, why did it take you so long? And Bo Qin says, I was changing their customs and altering their rituals. Okay. Now, of course, we have to know that Zhou Gong is the purported inventor of Zhou dynasty rituals. We keep that in mind. The story was different with Taigong Wang, and I think it's not inconsequential that Taigong Wang is a senior figure, whereas Bo Qin is a youngster. Taigong Wang comes after a few months back to Zhou Gong to make his report. And when Zhou Gong asks him, how could you be so quick? Taigong said he had merely simplified the rituals and otherwise followed local custom. And Zhou Gong here happens to make a pronouncement. Not that what he did with his sons is so terrible, but that it was probably the product of immaturity. And as a result of it, Lu would surely in future become subordinated to Qi. And what's interesting here, of course, is that we're also seeing that what we regard as rituals in Lu coming down from Zhou Gong are not coming down from Zhou Gong, but from his son. Very interesting complication in the stories that are circulating. Okay, so we moderns basically tend to treat exemplary figures in childish ways, good, bad, this, that, okay. really you can only see what is at stake in studying a figure if you know the broader conversations that are going on at the time. And almost all of us treat these heroes as individuals, not as members of families or networks within the governing elite. We have to realize that people are thinking, what would be good for my family? What would be good for my patron? What would be good for my network of allies, all right? And so essentially, there is no way that these figures do not have to keep trying to figure out what the spirit, the driving spirit of these exemplary figures is. Now, it's not that everybody in Han Dynasty wasn't trying to just boil this down to a message or a slogan. Here is Ban Gu ordering 2,000 figures from the pre-Han period according to 9 ranks. And he would like this just to be, okay, this guy is equal to this. But one reason he'd like to make this simpler going forward, and by the way, he fails utterly to make it simpler going forward. One reason he'd like to make it simpler going forward is that he thinks some of the debates over the exemplary figures, including Qu Yuan or Shu Shentong, these are actually detrimental to the court as they are construed. One thing I'd really like to emphasize, and I could have chosen many, many passages here, but when I was reading with a graduate student of mine a couple of weeks ago, says it all, that exemplary figures are often born among the 5D or the 8 Man, okay? So go north, go south, but they applied their merits in constructive ways in Qi and Qin, the courts they served. I think all of us for far too long have had a single passage Mencius in mind, where Mencius is dissing someone as being from Chu, and what he's really trying to do is slander the person and saying he's not good enough. But we know that actually Chu and Lu had very close connections throughout this period in classical learning. And if we didn't know it before, there are plenty of people who have demonstrated this in the modern period, including An Zuozhuang, Wang Baoxuan, and others. So it's not that the people in early China don't understand the idea of progress or fundamental change. You simply have to read Han Feizi to understand that. No, they had a sense of changes, but what they were really preoccupied was what makes an experience salutary in the time, and what makes the future not only viable, but a future worth living. That is their essential question. And so when they're faced with thousands and thousands of exemplary figures, they don't all respond the way Ban Gu responds, by trying to rank them, by trying to control them. Instead, and this is also found in Ban Gu, what they're looking for is the Da-yi, the great ideas, or the Yao, the essentials, as these are what will guide people through difficult experiences. I wanted to basically only give 2 more slides on the complexity of the project they were engaged in. And this is a famous passage. And here we have 3 exemplars, and they're all governing their localities in different ways. And this is a passage that is repeated long past the early empires. Well, which one is better? Should you make the people unable to deceive the rulers? Should you make them unable to bear to deceive the ruler, or should you make them unable, undaring? They did not dare to deceive the ruler. And usually the answer is a bit of both. You make the malefactors, the evildoers, not dare to act on their impulses, whereas the others, you give them more complex guideposts. So anyway, as far as I'm concerned, you can read Bourdieu or you can read Schrunze, and you're ending up exactly in the same place. That cultural reproduction is never about either obedience to a tradition or exact replication of a tradition. It always is about adapting the traditions that you know to the community that you are in. And if you're doing that thoughtfully, what is important about those traditions will be transmitted down through time. Now, the last paragraph is very important. A combination of myopia, risk aversion, and a propensity to free ride is a powerful force working against self-realization in every community, and past or present. But to realize oneself is not against a community, but rather a contribution to the community. It can help foster community. And here I'll invoke a phrase that is invoked way too often to the wrong ends, but people in my time are talking about it, and it's he er bu tong. Community rests on the notion that there will be a division of talents and unique insights, and that it's better to work together. The real problem that those who are self-identified Confucians, but not only them, have to say is all this learning, does it represent a source of misery or a source of pleasure? There is no way to prove. It's certainly hard work all the time. There is no way to prove by a pleasure calculus at what point misery turns into a source of pleasure. But these guys took it on faith that this was so and operated on that assumption. So they weren't going by other utilitarian ideas, modern ideas. What they were going on is try it and you will find you like it. It wins you the respect of your peers, and it allows you to look at yourself in the mirror calmly. So this relates to this side, and what I really want to say is people do not simply wish to act. They also wish to describe their actions in ways that they themselves and others will find acceptable. They want to deflect possible criticism, and they wish to enlist active support for the projects they think are important. Okay. So what I would like to do is disambiguate two terms, the desire for fame and the desire for social approbation of your peers, people from whom you wish to get respect from. These are not the same things, okay? So finally, moving right along, what makes a person worthy or wise? That is a central question, and there are a million answers. Here, Lunheng has got a very interesting chapter called Defining Worthies. And number 14, there are 21 criteria for worthiness. He's going to say all of them are deeply flawed. But number 14 concerns us here. Well, what about the people who study the classics and their followers? And are they worthy? And basically Wang Chung is saying, and certainly he is classically trained by many accounts. He studied with Ban Gu under Ban Biao's direction. That is not an early tradition, but generally accepted. He knows too much about the court otherwise. In any case, the point is that it's never easy to know people, and that most people who say, oh, I know so-and-so about a person is completely wrong. You don't have to be classically untrained to be worried about the rule. Okay. Now, clearly, what is worthy is not Tanping. Okay. If we were going to characterize the sages from the period that I work in, the early empires, they're not lofty transcendents who don't have a care. What they are people who work and worry on behalf of others. The main models for them are the archer who reliably hits a target every time, not once in a blue moon, and the poet who has read and written 1,000 poems, not one. Everything boils down to praxis, not book learning. I have to laugh because I was reading some books on Li Ziho. This modern 1994 claim is that practice has never been an object of study in its own right. I'd like to say people in Han Dynasty do nothing following Xunzi except talk about practice. So moving right along. If we're talking about heroes in China, they are marked by epistemological modesty. They do not know everything, and that is what they say. There are many scenes in the Analects, which is, of course, a late tradition, but let's take it for the moment as an important tradition, where Confucius is saying, what have I done wrong? I simply don't know. What will I do? He is no lofty transcendent. In fact, he goes to his death by the Shiji biography thinking he has been a total failure. What my texts also know is that there are real dangers attached to absolute faithfulness to a single role or a single principle. And we have the old time story of Wei Sheng, who drowns because he had promised that he would meet his girlfriend under a pillar of a bridge. So much for Wei Sheng. He's always used as a warning in my period. And I think we have modern counterparts to that. Marker number 1. I recently wrote a paper with a friend of mine, Marty Verhoeven, and he and I wrote about 2 aspects. One was swimming and one was listening. Let me deal with listening first. Many of us do not pay sufficient attention to this tradition about Confucius, where someone snidely remarks to a disciple of Confucius, hey, I thought your master was an expert on rituals, so how is it that every time he goes into the ancestral temple, he asks about every part of the liturgy? Confucius, you can imagine smiling, saying, yeah, that is the ritual. Not to be a show-off, not to act as if you know, to be willing to both go forward when necessary, but also retreat when necessary. So to style yourself as the unknowing when necessary. Here's 2 early quotations. The first one, the Son of Heaven, though capable of walking, does not make a move without his chancellor, nor does he issue policy pronouncements without prior consultation with his officials, though he is capable of speech, meaning he could do this on his own, but the wise person consults with many others. The Chunqiu Fan Lu summarizes this kind of thinking in the quotation I put on the slide. And just to let you know that this is early and long before Chunqiu Fan Lu, in the Yizhou Shu and in the Shiji, we have the same spatial plan talked about. In the one case, and the Yizhou Shu, if memory serves, I should go back and look, it's the Wang Hui. It's King Wu dies so quickly, it might be King Cheng. But anyway, early Western Zhou ruler, 9 people face south and 8 wear the pearl crown, not the emperor himself. There's nothing the emperor should be shielded from in this early text. And this is more or less repeated of King Wu in Shiji 30 in talking about the early. Now, when you look at all of Cai Zhezhong's marvelous cartoons, he got it in one: detailed inquiry, careful thought, respecting the ministers, being considerate to all officials, which means listening to them. So here we are. Let me take swimming. By the time you're a member of the governing elite, you should have trained yourself in so many ways that you are now, as it were, riding along the waves of your high cultural learning. You never have to think about yourself. And that's how you can stay afloat. All right. By that point, you don't always know why you do what you do. What you must do is respond to the exigencies of the situation, but you have ingested what are the main guidelines and what are the essentials that you are to glean from high cultural learning. I did this paper on swimming with a Buddhist monk, and what we were amazed about, and think about it, we're talking mainly about people who are operating on the North China Plain. They're not swimmers. Why are they using this metaphor? What does it say to them about the way they need to trust to the way they have been trained in cultural learning? These are the takeaways, and I won't spend a lot of time on them. I think number 1 and number 6 are the most important. Personal cultivation is social cultivation, and both make for good governance, whether it's in the capital or in the localities. And when we talk about the crowd, the Chun in Xunzi's political treatises, this couldn't be more different from talk of the masses, the Renmin, in 20th and 20th century discussions. And interestingly, there's a parallel here. Hannah Arendt talked about this in terms of early Greek versus modern Euro-American civilizations that claim the Greeks. What is going on? The Chun is local communities of people who trust each other to have community interest at hand. So when we say there's no impulse to denigrate political action in early China, members of the governing elite would be denigrating their own judgment were they to spend much time. They know they're good emperors, they know they're bad emperors, but they also know the court is deciding things as a court, to which the emperor then affixes his seal, saying "ke." Again, it's important for people in positions of influence to stay aware of the limits of their perception and ability. To buy your own hype, i.e., if you are a ruler of a country, is to court disaster. This was said about Putin. It applies equally well to the world of early China and many modern countries as well. I'll leave that. You should, as a ruler, indeed you must, do everything you can to shepherd and preserve your legitimacy in the eyes of those who effectively grant you the power you wield. Thank you. Good. I'll stop sharing.
Many thanks. That's wonderful, and really just such a rich presentation that we have so much to pick apart. Unfortunately, not long to do so in remaining time before you have to, I know, move on to other things. But we do have 20 minutes, I believe, remaining. So in that time, I think we have Richard here as well now. So I'm going to invite Richard, who I apologise, Richard, I did give you a very a good introduction when you were not actually here yet. So I'm going to just proceed with allowing you to. If
Sarah, may we just say for those of you who came late that Trenton and I will be on for an hour next week. On this. Yeah.
As part of the further discussion, which I think Paul's put a link into the chat for, and is also on the website as well. Those of you who want to continue the discussion on the 14th.
Okay.
So if Richard would like to go first in a response, and then Michael will have an opportunity to respond. Apologise, Richard, for not reintroducing you.
No.
But glad you got on with us, and it was an honorific presentation. Sorry, an introduction to your background and your interests. And so yes, please go ahead with your thoughts and responses.
Right. Well, many thanks, Michael. So over the years, I've learned a very great deal from you. And there were two questions you've asked me in the past, which have remained with me, which are very closely associated with what you've been saying. So I'm a flat-footed philosopher and not sophisticated at all. So what I'm going to ask you about are universals. And you once asked me, so why be interested in universals? And I think this is a very deep question indeed. But you also use the expression today, the essentials. I remember I was once being rude about the Jinxin, the last chapter of the Mencius, saying it's scrappy bits they didn't know what to do with. And you said nonsense. They're pithy sayings which you have in your repertoire for that terrible moment when you have to give advice to someone who might take away your life if you give the wrong advice. And of course, pithy sayings do tend to be pretty universal in some sense or another. And of course, there is a fundamental question at the back of my mind, which I think should occupy people who are interested in philosophy, is there doctrine in early Chinese thought?
Okay. Do you want me to answer, or do you have further comments?
I mean, I think there is, and I think it's you know, if you say sing you're saying something fairly universal, and I think that is something you would have learned by hanging out with Xunzi. Not all you would have learned by any means at all. It is something that he mentions in the first chapter of the collection as we have it. So it is something that would have played a role. And it is certainly, in some sense, foundational for what he does. And indeed, if we want to have arguments to get to a terrible problem, if we want to have arguments, we do have to have universal statements of some kind. Do we learn? My question is: do we learn universals, Michael?
And I would say no. Here's what my training as a historian has taught me: that we tell stories. And my training as a sometime reader of neuroscience and psychology is that mostly we have three stories that we return to over and over again to shape the complexities of the world. So what I would say is we have working hypotheses and hunches, and it's the extraordinary person who is able to change those working hypotheses and assumptions But what we have in the early period, and this is what I teach my students, we have orthopraxy. It's not that people don't sometimes try to explain why we have these practices, but what we have is right conduct and polite conduct, and an ability to think outside the box, having trained ourselves on multiple historical and pseudo-historical examples. So I don't deny, and in fact, my last slide would lead to the notion that I think there are some universals that smart people in power, as opposed to dumb people in power, know that they had better widely consult with the people whom they purport to be ruling. That's my current preoccupation. And I believe that's a good working hypothesis for everyone, which is not to say there are not totalitarians in the world who seem to flourish. So
wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think now, given the time, we move on to Trenton responding also to the paper and questions that you may wish to raise. Many thanks.
Right. I don't have so much as a question, but I do have sort of a, I guess, a set of footnotes maybe to draw some of the ideas together. So if I can share my screen briefly, I would appreciate that. But if not, that's okay.
You should be able to, Trenton. If
Okay.
Yeah, you should be. Yeah.
Okay. It's blocking me, but that's okay.
It may be that he needs to be upgraded to a
co-host.
yeah,
Yeah, sure.
co-host.
Mhm.